So as you can see here, the seaweed has kind of like a common stem down here, and there are leaf-like structures going off it. So they start from a kind of stub, they go up a stem, and then the stem kind of flattens. So welcome to Arty Farty Metal. Today what we're going to be working on is seaweed, and of course, you know, this is very arty farty with a lot of latitude. This is some of the work I've done so far. Anyway, the reason why I decided to work on seaweed I've got a lot of these pieces of leaves that the fabricator cuts out, so they like the negative, so I've got the positives. You see a lot of these have got curves in them. Now I must admit I did use a Lithuanian blacksmith farrier furnace, just a tiny one, about that long and about so wide, that high. But there's a much easier way to bend metal. This is only 3mm, by the way. What you'll need to do is put the metal in a vise, and I've got a big thick mallet, and what I'm going to do is just give it two hits, and then I'll move on to the next part. Because you want it to look like a smooth curve. So we've got a bit of a curve here. You can always go back, get more curve. And of course, the thinner the metal is, the more it will curve as you hit it. So you can see what happens if you bang it too hard. But you can go back and sort of try and undo that. So I've kind of got that nasty kink out and made it a bit smoother. The next thing I have to work out is where on earth will I put it? I mean, how will I attach it? So I'm thinking something like this. I might be able to attach it there. And let's see, what about there? I could try another piece. Yeah, maybe I'll try that piece instead. I have decided to do this bit first. You can see it's very delicately balanced there, and a tack weld at, well, sort of one end and a tack weld at the other end. So you can see there I've just managed to tack the two ends. I'm also thinking, before I put something in place, am I going to be able to reach the grinder end to try and get rid of any excess weld? So that's something you need to think about. Okay, I'm going to weld the rest of this now and grind it back. I'm ready to grind. I pushed it back against a heavy wooden block so I can get in there to grind. It's a bit hard to put it into. Now, what I'm going to do here is weld this on, and so I'm just going to hold it in place while I actually weld it. So I've welded this on now, but obviously it looks a bit funny, that bit on the corner there sticking out. So what I'm going to do is just take my angle grinder and cut into that curve. So you can see I've joined it here, I've ground it down, and I'm going to start working on the leaf things to the side. So that bit got welded on. What I've noticed, I need to be really careful about these holes here that are due to laser cutting, because they can make things very weak. So I either have to put a weld in there or cut them off. Now, what I'm thinking of doing now is putting that or that on like that, and I'll continue the kind of wavy stem using a devil's forge. Well, this is actually what they're called. They come from, I bought it on eBay, they come from Lithuania. So I think I mentioned before that I had bent a lot of these in the forge. And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to bend this a bit more, and I'm going to end up placing this on the bottom. But I want to flatten this out about 1 centimetre before I do. Now, I could use an oxyacetylene torch, but oxyacetylene is very expensive. This here is just propane gas that you can get from the petrol station, and you just link it up to the forge. So I'll talk more a bit about this later. Now, how do you need to prepare yourself before using a forge? Well, I've got some of these oxyacetylene glasses. Some people wear sunglasses. I got heavy gloves. I've got these, I don't know what they call them, pincer things. I wanted to point out the hose for this, the hose running to the gas bottle. Just make sure, and this is probably common sense, but make sure it's not over one of the front doors. Make sure it's at right angles to the side of the burner. And you can adjust this. If you have the right size spanner, you can take this off and actually move it around. So I was beating with a hammer on top of the anvil, and I've managed to, well, at least the one closest to us, flatten that out a bit, and the other one not so well, but I've run out of gas. The idea now is to match those two together. What I might actually do is just cut both a bit further back, so I've got a thicker joining point, a greater diameter joining point. So I'm hoping spreading it out like this on the concrete gives you a better idea of what I'm trying to do. So as you can see, I'm going to join this flattened out bit of rod. So I started to weld these two bits together, and I suddenly realized that this bit here is really thin. This is 3mm. This bit here is 3mm, and this bit is probably 1mm. So what I've done now, I've turned the electricity down, and I'm going to use a much smaller rod. So I'm just looking over at the welds at the moment, just checking that. I don't know if you can see, there's a little bit of a hole there in that one. Now that I've grinded it off, it's a bit clearer. And then the other thing I'm going to do is fill in where the laser cutter went in. So there's little holes because of that. And then the last thing I'm going to do is, many of these edges are very pointed. So what I'm going to do is just go dig and that will put sort of a round bit of weld on each end, and that will take the sharpness off. And I'm also checking to just see if any of these welds feel loose. If they're not, that's great news. So you can see I've welded together that these two. Actually doesn't look like a very good weld. Let's have a look at the other side. Okay, it's quite nice on the other side. So this gives you a bit of an idea of what the seaweed will look like in 3D. So yeah, I'm reasonably happy with it. Now I'm going to work on the other piece. So today what I'm doing is working on the other branch of seaweed, if you like. You can see I'm going to weld these two pieces here. One's only about 1 millimeter thick and the other's probably 2 to 3 millimeters thick. So I'm going to use a fairly small welding rod and turn the voltage down. I'm going to be welding this piece onto there. I might have to get the angle grinder in and sort of cut it more to size. And the other piece I'm doing is this piece to here. So this is going to be a lot smaller than the other piece of seaweed, and it's good to have that kind of contrast. And then they'll all be welded onto the seaweed box. As I said, I was dealing with very thin metal when I was welding this. I've made a hole in that, as you can see. So I could just keep going, hoping the metal will cool down enough. But I'm just going to start on another section first, and then I'll come back to this. So I'm reasonably happy with these welds. So remember what I said was when you start a weld, you put welding two pieces together, you put a tack weld on one end and a tack weld on the other end. Because this one here is very thin steel, and so that tack weld actually burnt through. So I've done a sort of chipping thing on it, and I brushed it, and I'm going to try and weld in that bit there. I'm not sure if I can. And the way I'm going to do this is position it so that when I start the weld, it'll be sloping down and then I'll come across. But that's actually like a 30-degree slope. And the reason is so that the weld runs backwards rather than forwards. That looks better. I seem to have filled in that gap, but I won't really know until I've actually ground it down. That looks a lot better. I still see a bit of slag in there. I might have to do this end as well. The problem with having a bit of slag in there is years later water gets in there and it starts to rust from there. And then someone comes and brings the work back complaining it's fallen apart. So you can see it's not a perfect weld there. A lot of mucking about. I can see a little bit of slag in there and a little bit over here, but I think that's enough for my purposes. You can be a real perfectionist if you need to be. So just like the other piece of seaweed, I'm going to fill in these little holes that are made by the laser cutter, and then all these points, I'm just going to put a bit of weld on each one of those. It only needs to be a really tiny bit of weld to take the sharpness off. So you can see it's really just at these very tips here that I've put a bit of weld. It won't stop it from poking in someone's eye, but it will stop it from scratching someone as they walk by. You need to look carefully through it and make sure there's nothing you've forgotten to weld off. And also just feel with your hands, there's a bit of splatter there. So at this point I finished the seaweed, and you can probably see I put what I call the primary one up on the actual seaweed box. I put a weld on one side and a weld on the other side. It's notoriously hard to do these things. Some people can move their hand around and do it all in one turn, but I can't. So just a close-up, I put a tack here and a tack there. What makes it hard is that this stalk is, I don't know how many mils, but an awful lot thicker than what it's been welded onto. I've actually put this up at a bit of a lean, so it'll make it easier for me to get in here and weld that. So you can see if you've got the right tilt to it, it makes life a little bit easier. Now I've just got to do around this section. I've messed up this section a bit, there's a bit of slag in there. You can try and get it out with a rod, as well as chipping and brushing. Now, one of the things that you've got to be careful of is the angle at which you use the chipper. The other thing that I've done here, and I forgot to mention, I've turned the voltage down, because what you don't want is this weld eating in to this metal, which can happen if the metal gets too hot. So you need, it's a bit of a balance. You need a sort of high voltage for the larger stalk, but you need a low voltage for this metal on the bottom. The other thing people do is they kind of angle the they angle the welding rod so that it's more facing the thicker metal. So I've sort of messed up this weld a bit. I'm struggling with a lot of slag in here. I'm going to cheat a bit. I'm going to get my angle grinder on there and try and grind back the weld a bit, so I can have another go. So I've ground that section down a bit. I'm going to put the chipper on it again and also try and sort of scratch out with the end of the welding rod this little bit in here. What you've got to be really careful of when you're doing this is not to put the grinder into the stalk, which is very easy to do in my experience. So we've got after a lot of mucking around, we've got a reasonable weld there. I can see it's not perfect, but yeah, you can just keep going with this sort of thing until it's perfect, if you like. Now the next part of this is trying to get the other seaweed on. The question is, what angle do we actually put this at? And the rod I can cut at a particular angle so it slopes backward or forward, but when I weld it I must make sure that the bottom of the stalk is flat against the plinth. So I can see a bit of slag here. It's not in a good place. I could leave it. It's going to be really hard to get it out of there. But what I'm going to do, it's going to be hard to get out, but what I'm going to do is switch to a high voltage and a smaller rod. So I'm going to picket it, chip it, brush it, and then the small rod. So often the small rod will burn out the slag, small rod at a high temperature. So they're both on now. The last part of this is just using a sanding disc. Sanding disc on my grinder. And I'm just going to check that there's nothing, no little bits of splatter or slag. So this is our seaweed sculpture. Let's walk around it a bit. It's had time to rust. And, you know, if I must say, what I really should have done is those stems needed to be a bit more bent. However, in the ocean, the stems are quite straight, so I was being a bit... I could have used some more artistic license. So what I've done is use a dry brush to try and brush the inside and the outside and brush all the cobwebs off. Next, what I'm going to do is coat it with Penetrol. So this is Penetrol. and it sort of gives it a finished look, but also it's a protection. You probably notice on the top it says poison, so I've got some gloves here that I'm going to use. So you can see now we've got our coating of Penetrol on. Mistakes become a bit less obvious, and at these sort of lower points, like here, that's where you might find some dripping, so just check it very carefully and check that you've covered everywhere, and that's really hard to do unless you're out in the sun. And of course you can try to get inside it as much as possible, but that's, I can see a little drip there. There we are. And yeah, hairs, brushes, bits of grass,